Catherine asked me if I would give a big picture of what we're looking at, and maybe this is a picture from a lot higher than she was expecting, but I really do think that if we are to assess the effectiveness and the viability of whatever we come up with as ways of addressing the crisis that we find ourselves in, we're going to have a backdrop of that big picture to be always testing what may be or may not be possible. The crisis that has engulfed the university in the last 30 years is a result of the contemporary circumstance of universal commodification as it impinges on the institution of the university and its self-understanding. Commodification now reaches into every aspect of our lives, and activities and institutions previously not considered commodities or traffickers in commodities have been forcefully subjected to the new regime of commodification. There was a time when the social understanding of the university and of the work performed in it was defined precisely in opposition to the logic of instrumentality and marketability, but that situation obtains no longer. We now have an immense list of books that inveigh against the contemporary situation as it inflects the university from Derek Bock's Universities in the Marketplace, from 2003 to College, What It Was, Is, and Should Be by Andrew Del Banco, to William Deresowicz's excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite, and The Way to a Meaningful Life, which was published just last year. Granted, we need to identify a problem before we can address it, but we seem to have gotten stuck in an arc that goes from diagnosis to Jeremiah to exhortations to take back the university that are long a complaint and short on prescription. One of the reasons for our being in this rut is that while we have the language to name the crisis, that same language paralyzes us when it comes to articulating what a future for the humanities and the university may look like under this new historical dispensation. In a powerful proposal that puts a finer point to the foregoing description of the imperial mandate of the humanities, Deirdre Reber has argued recently along the same lines to describe what she sees as a transition between empire and global capitalism, and I'm quoting Reber here. The humanities came into being as an instrument of empire to navigate the divide between imperial administrators and barbarians. Those barbarians were once the colonized, and the returns on the investment in the humanities were implicitly understood as a function of the protection of the economic interests of empire. But now that empire has been displaced by global capitalism, the educational apparatus of empire is superfluous. It is not that capitalism does not have its own pedagogical apparatus. As a neo-imperial force, it certainly does. It is just that its pedagogical apparatus does not depend any longer on institutions of higher learning. Media culture has become the global forum for the instruction of capitalist subjects and the inculcation of capitalist ideology. Universities are no longer the privileged site at the top of the cultural totem pole for the arbitration of culture. The terms of barbarism have changed. Barbarians are no longer the uneducated or the ones who cling to local knowledge. They're now they who do not yet consume. Capitalism now invitates everyone, grants everyone easy access to participate in consumption. There is no longer any need for a more involved form of education in the ways of the colonizer than simply to consume. The fundamental model of power has changed from one in which cultural dictates came from on high, imposed vertically, in which the university was made in the image of empire, to one in which cultural dictates now come horizontally from the infinitely democratizing market, in which the university becomes yet another venue for consumption, no longer obedient to itself as its own master, but obedient to market forces. It is not that education as such has disappeared, it is that it is being reconceived as one more product in the cultural marketplace. End of quote. As Reber argues, if the other is not a subject but a consumer, the means used for its subjection as an ideological subject must be radically different. Cultural differences either become meaningless or are mobilized to turn that subject into a more efficient or effective consumer. But in any event, there is no need to convert the other into another version of the imperial self, and therefore no pedagogical program need accompany the exchange. The same applies to the Western subject, who is no longer construed as a repository of a self-cultivated and unique sensibility born from self-knowledge and introspection, but rather as the aggregate of specific habits and practices of consumption. The depth, dimension, and complexity of the subject disappear, overtaken by a horizontal, superficial agency built on discrete consumer transactions, all of which take place in the endless present of consumption, which has no past and no future because it satisfies needs that are experienced as disconnected from context and history. And as Reber concludes above, this new pedagogy of consumption does not require the institutional mediation of the university for its articulation. That's the hole we're in. With respect to the local Western subject, one may quibble with the particulars of Bill Redding's interpretation of the university's current difficulties as an institution in his seminal book, The University in Ruins, but I have yet to read another account of that circumstance that is more convincing and that does not prescribe the activist return to some version of the status quo ante. The interpretive force of Redding's argument stems, in fact, from the historical considerations whence his argument arises. One of the corollaries of his perspective could be summarized as follows. The university was always subject to market and social forces. We've known that. But for the majority of its history, it was granted the right to make a claim to exception from them because it was thought to be involved in a spiritual project related to the articulation in time of the nation state. Almost everything that is perceived nowadays as a crisis in the university issues directly or in a mediated fashion from the university's loss of its connection to this spiritual enterprise of national proportions. According to Redding's, the university's consequent inability to work effectively in this alien set of circumstances has led to its invoking the abstract category of excellence as a legitimating strategy. Hence, in this fashion, the university finds itself using a rhetoric that is antithetical to its founding principles while being fully aware that there is no return possible to its previous claim to exception from market forces and instrumentality. All of us must continue to live and work in and through the university, an institution whose rhetoric of social relevance is in the process of being dismantled, and devise new narratives of legitimation that will work within the logic that now envelops us and which is responsible for the seemingly weekly news about closings or cutbacks of language, literature, classics, and other humanities departments. The new logic of commodification has affected the humanities disproportionately since they do not produce much that is tangible and commodifiable, and students, the customers, so to say, who constitute the new academic market, have been increasingly abandoning its study, all of which positions the humanities as net losers, as costly investments that cannot account for themselves under the new logic of marketability. But it is not just the humanities that have been transformed by the new circumstances. One has only to take into consideration the significant decline in the funding of basic science research in favor of translational science projects to understand that even the natural sciences cannot count on immunity from the new logic that now rules the university. We can continue to argue that the university as a place where universal knowledge is advanced, we can continue to argue that the university is the place where universal knowledge is advanced, where individuals find intellectual fulfillment, where the professional classes are trained, where social equity can be nurtured, where natural talent can transcend the limitations imposed by social class, where citizenship is shaped, where the spirit of democracy is instilled, and etc. We have one book that makes each one of those arguments published in the last 20 years or so. But the university but the logic of commodification demands that any engagement with it be cast in terms that are comprehensible to it and within it. What happens, for instance, when we look at graduate education and the requirements of a graduate degree as commodities produced by us that will be assigned a value with which to circulate in the market. And I know that this sounds incredibly crass and antithetical to what we represent, but what happens if we looked at what we produce in that fashion? What aspects of their production make them refractory to the universal convertibility into a commodity demanded by the unrelenting logic of the market? In other words, I am less interested in proposing responses to the crisis than in examining our current practices to underscore those that seem to me to make it difficult, if not impossible, to engage in the radical transformation of graduate education that our new circumstances demand. For even the resistance to the requirements of commodification will need to be articulated in terms that are commensurable with that logic. For instance, if we are ever to make any claims for the subject, we will have to contend with a new understanding of the self that is not based on concepts and metaphors of depth or uniqueness, but rather one that will be articulated not in a vertical but in a horizontal understanding of subjectivity. The same applies to our interpretive practices. Whether you favor Franco Moretti's distant reading or Sharon Marcus's surface reading, you have always already lost depth as a metaphoric dimension to describe or account for what we do. It is not that depth has ceased to exist. It is that connectivity and interrelations in a horizontal plane, seemingly extending forever in all directions, are now the presumed context in which both the self and our interpretive agency manifest and construct themselves. What I would like to propose is that the conception of academic work as a performance of a series of practices is essential if we are to negotiate rather than resolve the current crisis of the university. Such a view requires that departments understand the training of their graduate students primarily as a professional endeavor that is intellectual in nature rather than as the reverse, that is, as an intellectual project that has a professional dimension that one may choose to acknowledge or not, which is the assumption that still prevails among most of us in academia, and which is why connected academics and such movements and initiatives are needed to be able to shift the perspective into an understanding of what we do as a professional endeavor. The resistance to understand what we do as a professional endeavor harks back to the understanding of the university as a place that defined itself in opposition to the professional, as the context from which instrumentality was banished. But upholding such conceptions of the university does not help our students to navigate it, and buttresses the mystified status of what we do as a calling rather than as a métier or a craft, a profession like any other, a characterization that does not constitute in any way an attempt on my part to disparage it. If we use that optic to analyze what we do in our departments, everything from the profile of the students we accept into our graduate programs, to the kind of courses we teach, to the final papers assigned, to qualifying exam reading lists, to the kind of dissertation projects that students engage in, would change radically and forever. Some critics have proposed that the answer to the crisis of the humanities is to reconceive the humanities as a category that will be able to compete in the educational market, and that the way to do that is to underscore that the humanities teach a set of skills that are transportable to other professional contexts: critical thinking, effective and precise writing, the mastery of interpretive strategies, etc. I am generally in tactical agreement with this view, principally because it recognizes that our displeasure at the current situation will not, by that very fact, reverse the new logic of commodification with which the humanities will have to contend henceforth. But I also think that the proponents of this argument do not pay sufficient attention to the fact that there are several other non-humanistic branches of knowledge that develop those same skills. We should indeed think of ourselves as the purveyors of a set of professional skills that are transferable to many other professional contexts, rather than as the custodians and transmitters of a particular content. But if the humanities cannot lay claim to being the only providers of such skills, our invoking their nurturing of those skills as an explanation and justification of their value to the market will not be an effective strategy. And while we cannot change those structures unilaterally and by fiat within the university, we can certainly enlarge their scope by expanding them to outside the university, by understanding the work that goes on in our departments as horizontally extensive to creators, institutions, agencies, and projects outside of it, which may help us identify surprising and new building blocks for envisioning possible versions of our future. This is, of course, one of the commendable thrusts of the Creative Academics Initiative, and it is also an effective way of opening up the university to its purported outside. By sharing widely the custody of the object of study bestowed on us by the late 19th century understanding of the disciplines, and which still dictates to a large extent the boundaries of our departmental units. Many current commentators, Martha Nussbaum and the previously mentioned Del Banco and Dershowitz among them, have argued that the humanities must reclaim their role as the guardians of knowledge and tradition, that we should retreat explicitly from the recent theoretical disposition of the humanities, embrace teaching preferentially over research, and make humanistic language transparent and accessible. But I would argue exactly the reverse. The humanities are valuable because they do the absolute opposite. They challenge received ideas, they undermine the doxa, they create complexity where there is apparent simplicity, and unmask ideological expediency where there is purported common sense. This rigorous mode of thinking and operating is, in point of fact, what the sciences and the humanities share in common, and the only way in which they will be able to coexist, and it is the only way in which they will be able to coexist in mutual respect. But we must convince the disciplines currently favored by the market, which David Hollinger referred to recently as the rigor displaying disciplines, that their contact with the humanities will make them stronger precisely because of the complications that we cannot help but introduce and sustain. The humanities will find, if we do this, the humanities will find not just interlocutors, but a place at the table. But for that negotiation and conversation to take place, we need to move out of our very own narrow understanding of the humanities as identified with the non-technical or the non-scientific. For instance, if we cannot acquire a fundamental yet rigorous knowledge of the workings of the digital environment, we will never be in a position to address convincingly the significance of its social role, or argue effectively about the future of the library as an institution. It is perhaps not absolutely essential to know how a web page is literally built block by block on our preferred browser for our viewing, but it is important to understand what is possible for big data to know about us, both individually and collectively. By the same token, humanists and social scientists can readily engage critically with the category of personalized medicine that Columbia has chosen recently to pursue as a priority. But if they do not make an effort to understand with a sufficient degree of precision the fundamentals of genetic transmission of information, their critique will not carry much weight. These are admittedly superficial examples, but they all point to the same reality and necessity. Rather than wallow in our irrelevance or articulate an indignant defense of what we were in some mythical past, the humanities must instead aggressively and cheerfully construct our half of the bridge that will allow us to connect with the contemporary marketable disciplines from a position of strength. And that strength derives from our theoretical and critical dimension, whose messy rigor lies in affirming the incommensurability of language and the world, the conviction that it is systematically impossible to ascertain where language ends and where the world begins. But each of those disciplines enacts its own particular resistance to this realization, and if we are to engage them profitably, we must do so in the terms of their specific epistemological will to power. We have retreated, we the humanities, have retreated needlessly from becoming familiar with the specific knowledge produced by those disciplines, assuming that their current privileged status derives from a technical dimension to which we do not have access. But paraphrasing the classical humanist Shibboleth, nothing produced by another human mind should be assumed to be alien to us, and most especially when what is at stake is the affirmation of our continued relevance. I am not proposing we should all learn to write code, but I'm suggesting that, conversely, we should not think of doing so as a nonsensical or outlandish endeavor. Furthermore, the return trip across that bridge might allow us to look at ourselves with the knowledge gained in the trajectory there and back. What would happen, for instance, if we reconceived every object that we study and everything we say about it as information, pure and simple? What new ways of conceiving our intellectual activity might we imagine from that perspective? And you can see that this is essentially going in the direction of digital humanities, right? It is important for us to know which efforts to address our current plight should be nourished and which should be regarded as merely reactive epiphenomena that will drift into the evanescence of history. We must direct our thinking away from the lines of unproductive thought identified throughout this presentation and toward a creative understanding of a future that we can only begin to intuit nowadays, even as we are busily constructing it. To continually adjudicate the difference between these two possibilities is the hardest, but perhaps also the most meaningful challenge we face at present. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I do want to pose a couple of sort of friendly counterpoints. I do not hate assessment language, for example, and I think that's actually an important way of looking at program changes. I also might be a little bit less involved in crisis mode than some of the people that we have listened to, and I was happy to hear a somewhat more upbeat tone in your presentation. I would like to connect some of these thoughts that I'm presenting to what was presented yesterday, because the way the panelists yesterday laid out some issues really informed more or less what we did in the department and actually what we have been doing for almost 20 years, though on a slightly different level. Let me try to make this a little bit more concrete. We have developed in the German department through very extensive curricular discussions and collaboration between faculty and graduate students in these past 20 years, a culture, a departmental culture that is both very much informed by the very global discussions at professional organizations and in the field and in the discipline, but also a culture that allows for very specific and detail-oriented assessment of where we are as a program, how successful we are in our program, and also what we can do about it, and basically take leadership, a leadership position, I believe, in some of these, addressing some of the issues that the humanities and the foreign languages in particular face. Within that, I would like to make a connection that was, I think, missing a little bit yesterday, and that is that I think we need to look at the changes in the PhD programs really in the context of a continuum between the undergraduate curriculum and the graduate curriculum, because they're very intricately linked, and to just think about the PhD curriculum or the PhD program separately, I think does not make much sense, because the experiences, the learning opportunities of many of our graduate students are really locatable in the interaction and in the engagement with the undergraduate side of the academic enterprise. Um, the culture of assessment that I mentioned, we really started in looking at program evaluation aspects and learning outcomes assessment on the undergraduate curriculum, but we basically used very similar techniques to go and frame, or at least inform ourselves of some of the issues that were part of the graduate program and that we tried to address very much along the lines of the concerns articulated by the MLA report, though with a critical eye on that report too, because some of those issues might not actually be as relevant for, or we thought, or for our program as some others. So one thing we did, we actually engaged our current graduate students in conversation and tried to figure out what their needs are. We also did a survey of past graduates, and found out what their experience actually were, both in the academic field, but also in the non-academic sector. Maybe as a background, the German department has always been very supportive of people who would not go for academic appointments. Being in Washington and being really the only viable PhD program in this greater Washington, Baltimore, Baltimore maybe not, but Washington area in German leads to a number of graduates who, for various reasons, family reasons usually, cannot leave the area and also simply have different ideas about what they wish to do. And so while all the graduates who pursued or wanted to pursue an academic career and were movable did in fact find suitable positions, there are a lot of people from our programs who have jobs with non-identified government agencies and some more identified government agencies, and private sector jobs. So we valued that was brought up yesterday. We valued this as much as was possible. Sometimes, though, the overall culture, academic culture, still devalues people, graduates who search or who look for non-academic positions in such a way that even in that what we thought was a very nurturing environment, there's still some hesitation sometimes by graduates to really embrace the fact that they will not look for an academic position, and that is not just okay, but that it's really something that is even valued in the department. Now, from these various surveys and conversations, and actually a conversation among the faculty about what exactly it was that we were trying to accomplish with a PhD program in German literature and culture, and applied sort of German/applied linguistic second language acquisition, which is a very strong secondary focus in our program, we came up with what in assessment language would be called learning outcomes, and sort of from that went back and developed actually the surveys and also some of the program points that we needed to look at. There was really nothing that was so terribly surprising about some of these things. There were time to degree issues, though we were reasonably successful in getting people through the program in less than the 9 years that very many programs take at this point. There were aspects to tweak, for example, what exactly is the purpose of the second foreign language requirement, and it reminded me of a previous conversation where the third foreign language requirement was discussed 20 years ago, and since nobody could really come up with a particular idea why that was so, that we had to have 3 foreign languages. We decided to do away with it. So basically to prune those things which could arguably be called or viewed as just jumping through some hoops. Go back and actually look at what is the purpose of what we're doing here. Now the shift in the humanities from canon sort of transmitting area of human inquiry to one that is much more invested in theoretical or sort of cultural studies, media studies, types of more project-focused issues is not really reflected in much of the sort of administrative aspects of graduate education. I just mentioned that 3rd foreign language requirement, or even the 2nd one. You know, usually it's one of these things that that is not really articulated as what is the purpose of it, what is the outcome of it, but just yet another box to be checked. So some of the ways in which we tried to refocus this was to align some of the things that we did administratively, or the students had to do administratively and procedurally, to the actual purpose of what we thought was significant about these aspects for providing the learning and research and intellectual engagement opportunities that would lead then to something that we thought embodied the PhD. Let me give you an example. The 2nd foreign language requirement used to be something, either one had to take some strange exam that was administered by grouchy, though otherwise very friendly colleagues who used categories to evaluate that were obscure or non-existent. And you know, we probably did exactly the same thing for other PhD programs. So I'm not criticizing this. It's really a failure on our part was a failure to articulate what the purpose of this was. You know, de facto, of course, if you work in the 18th century, you might need to know French, but that was not really in any way articulated in the requirement. Now we changed it and said, no matter what, every graduate student has to take 2 semesters of a foreign language. What's the purpose of that? Well, it could be that somebody actually needs to take much more than that in order to be able to use French or Italian or whatever it is for a particular, or Polish. Actually, we have one who went to Poland for a whole year to study Polish because he wants to engage in research that requires that. So there is no upper limit on that, but what is the actual purpose in the humanities context for being engaged with that foreign language? Well, it's really an engagement at a very reflective level of the very fact that it is a foreign language. It's not just a skill, it's not just a tool, a research tool, it can be that too, but it's the engagement and actually seeing from the other side of the classroom what the engagement with the foreign language and foreign culture is. And that can be as valuable in the beginning Chinese class as it is in some literature class in French or Italian or Chinese even, if that is what is the within the intellectual profile and learning needs and intellectual engagement of the graduate student. We had long discussions based on the feedback we received from our own students on an issue that was raised yesterday by Julie Maloney. And I was really surprised to hear her passionate statement yesterday, which basically, if I understood her correctly, said the traditional PhD dissertation that she wrote on Eastern Washington State University was really all she wanted and all she needed. There might have been different interpretations of what she got out of it, but it was really a traditional dissertation that she wrote, and that gave her those kinds of habits of the mind, and also I hate to use the word skills always, because it seems like it's more than skill. It's a habit of the mind, that how to engage, how to approach issues, and be able to have judgment about these matters. And we actually ended up with a very similar position, that we did not want to sort of radically alter the dissertation. We changed certain ways in which people can get to it, to that point of dissertation writing, and to aid them in developing their proposals, for example, the transition from coursework to the actual writing and engagement with the dissertation, and streamlined that process, and also focused it more on the project of the dissertation rather than the coverage of some imaginary canon that still lingered in some of the language, but also some of the procedures of the qualifying exams. We did decide that the monograph or quasi-monograph dissertation was not the only way of really providing that project that did what, or would do what Jane McAuliffe yesterday called to dive deep into an issue. And I think you sometimes even have to dive deep into the surface and the horizontal in order to really understand that. And I think Moretti and others would agree. And so we have a different model of quasi, or of a dissertation, and that is a collection of essays linked with a reflective essay that actually tells us why these essays are in some way make up a deep engagement with intellectual issues that are in some way related and connected. So it opens up the way in which one can think about this deep engagement and drilling deep from the increasingly also not so appropriate form of the monograph, which usually isn't a monograph but may be made into a monograph or be split up into 5 essays that one is trying to publish in different venues. So those are some of the features. I know that there are some graduate students from the department here, so they can, in the discussion, also address maybe some of those issues from their perspective. But to sort of conclude, I think one really needs to look at these things as opportunities to rethink one's own intellectual endeavor and engage with it in a sort of integrated way, and integrated both as a program and on a programmatic level that reaches from the undergraduate program all the way to the PhD, but really reaches into the development of the faculty over their career span. So to engage with that in a way that that really makes within the program also a statement then about what the humanities are and what they can mean both at the student level as a contribution to research projects and as an engagement with the world. So thank you very much.